Hi everybody, thank you for coming. As Rabbi Yitzchak announced, we're trying to both cover some aspects of the Parsha and the Haftorah as well. That's kind of the Hosafa that we're trying this year. Hopefully it'll work out. Basically, the common denominator between the Parsha and the Haftorah is a very critical issue called succession. You know, Kohelet tells us, Dor holech v'dor ba. A generation goes and a new generation comes. The entire future of the Jewish people have a destiny. Hashem made a bris. God made a covenant with Abraham. This was a spiritual covenant in which the Jewish people were given a mission to be a light unto the world and to function within the confines of the holy territory of Eretz Israel. But a decision had to be made. Who would carry on the bris with Abraham? Abraham, after all, did have two children. He had Yishmael from Hagar, and he had Yitzchak from Sara. And in a sense, Avram didn't have to make a choice because HaKadosh Baruch Hu made that choice. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Ki bi Yitzchak yikarei lecha zara. It is through Yitzchak that your seed is going to be perpetuated. And in many ways, Yishmael, at least initially, is surprisingly passive in accepting his fate. Now, of course, later, that turned out to be a very, very difficult predicament for the Jewish people, and we suffer from it today. But basically, Yishmael gets banished with Hagar, never comes back. Similarly, although when after Sarah dies, Abraham takes a woman, Keturah, and according to Chazal, Keturah is actually Hagar, and she comes back as a new person. Keturah, Noim ma'asaha kiktoras. Her deeds are as pleasant as Keturah's. Yishmael doesn't come back per se, although we are told that he did tshuva of some sort. But indeed, Keturah comes back, and she becomes Abraham's wife, not just a concubine. And from Keturah, Abraham has 7 children, all of which become nations. But they too are sent to the east with matanot. So essentially, the playing board is being cleared, so to speak. Get rid of Yishmael, get rid of the Bnei Keturah, send him somewhere else. And who is left? The sole survivor, so to speak, whose mission is to perpetuate the bris of Avraham Avinu, is Yitzchak. And that is why, indeed, the Parsha goes on and talks about Yitzchak getting a wife, etc., who emulates the midot of Abraham in terms of Chesed. Right? So the two parts of the story are the death of Sara and the acquisition of a wife of Yitzchak. By the way, there's an interesting point. One very, very interesting area of halacha that's recently been the subject of a lot of debates, and I mentioned this morning, is the status of various alternative therapies that are rooted to some degree in Eastern religions. Acupuncture was the first, but now you have energy healing and reikis and chakras and all sorts of things that really their historical origin are in the practices and meditations of idolatrous religions. But there actually is a theory, it's a theory, I'm not sure if it has a clear makor in Chazal, that when Abraham gave the Bnei Keturah gifts and he sent them to the east is a not defined place, essentially he gave them the roots of what later became Eastern wisdom and philosophy and meditative techniques. So as a result, we Jews claim everything. Not only do we claim to be the source of Christianity and Islam, which are the Western religions, we also claim to be the source of the Eastern religions as well, which have a great, obviously things have been distorted and things have been changed and the like, but at its root, it is a Masorah from Avraham Avinu. Now, that doesn't resolve the halachic question, because the question becomes, have there been enough idolatrous elements to contaminate it? Or conversely, can you take something that has its roots in idolatry and uproot it and separate it, minatek, from the Avodah Zarah, so now it becomes parav, now it becomes neutral. Yoga is a very good example. Obviously, the meditative states of yoga were deeply connected to forms of religious worship, but you can take yoga, separate it, and use it as a tool of relaxation and stretching, in which there is not necessarily any religious connection. So this is a fairly lively debate. Now in Eretz Yisrael, at least among the people I meet, every other person seems to be an energy healer. It seems to be very popular. They say in Los Angeles, every other person is a screenwriter. Every waiter in every restaurant is writing a screenplay. In Eretz Yisrael, every other person I meet seems to be an energy healer. And as I say, there is a lively halachic debate. There was a very prominent Rav in Lakewood who wrote a huge book, 400 English pages and 500 Hebrew pages, so almost 1,000 pages, in which he argued by and large that most alternative therapies can indeed be utilized by a Torah-observant Jew. He's not saying they're valid, that's a separate issue, but in terms of halacha, they are not avodah zarah. But then there was another great rabbi who passed away a few years ago, Rabbi Belsky, Zichrono Livracha, who actually wrote a book claiming that most of them are still tainted with avodah zarah. So there's a debate going back and forth. But be it as it may, that's the fate of the Bnei Keturah. So Parshat Chayai Sara is very much about succession and the spiritual elimination of all of those who might be rivals for that succession. And what is interesting is that, number one, the choice of the successor was made by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And number two, we don't see any disagreements. Unlike the Yaakov and Esav struggle that we'll have in a few weeks, the Yitzchak-Yishmael struggle doesn't really seem to exist. Yishmael gets banished with Hagar. He's gone. That's about it. And the Bnei Keturah are sent away with gifts, and they don't even register a complaint. So in a sense, the passing of the baton to Yitzchak was a fairly simple procedure, and indeed God mandated that it be so. By contrast, the Haftorah also deals with a crisis in succession. David HaMelech is, of course, not the first king of Israel. The first king of Israel is Shaul, but it was understood at the outset that Shaul was intended to be a transitional monarch. In fact, this raises an interesting question, because remember that it was known all the way back from Yaakov Avinu's last will and testament that the Malchut, the rulership for Klal Yisrael, should repose in the tribe of Yehuda. In a sense, Shaul, who was from the tribe of Binyamin, was an anomaly. And in fact, the Rambam explains that because the Jewish people did not have a proper motive when they requested a king in the time of Shmuel, God gave them a monarchy that by definition was set up to fail. And in other words, Shaul was never intended to be the permanent monarch. Now, that raises an interesting question, which is not our subject today, and that is, the mashma'ut of the narrative in Shmuel is that Shaul forfeited the monarchy only because of the sin in not eradicating Amalek, implying, had he not sinned, his malchut would have continued. According to the Rambam, that's an impossibility, because the malchut was always destined to go to Yehuda. But be it as it may, the Davidic dynasty is clearly the malchut that God has in mind, and indeed the Mashiach will be a descendant of David HaMelech, Malchut based David and the like. But David has many, many sons, and the succession issues are not going to be as simple, because God does not directly intervene in this process, and it is left to the machinations and the various actions of human beings who are sometimes all too fallible. Again, I don't want to sound irreverent. To some degree, I'm just using an analogy, to some degree, if you're familiar with the Godfather saga, and how Michael Corleone had to, am I being taped here? Okay. And Michael Corleone had to eliminate all of his, didn't have to, but he decided that he needed to eliminate all of his potential rivals, sometimes in a violent way. We do see a certain spate of violence that's difficult to understand in this issue. Now, in order to understand the Haftorah, which is the beginning of the book of Malachim, we actually need to go back to the end of Shmuel and look at some of the preceding events in David HaMelech's life. David HaMelech himself had a very stormy rule. As we know, when he was anointed, Shaul was still king, and Shaul considered David to be a rival that he wanted to kill. David's life was in danger. Even when after Shaul was killed and David became king, initially, for 7 years, he was only accepted as king by the tribes of Yehuda and Binyamin, and his capital was in Hebron. It took 7 years of actual civil war, to some degree, before David could consolidate his rule over all of Am Yisrael, and then he moved the capital to the holy city of Yerushalayim, which he completed the conquest of as well. So David HaMelech's 40 years has 2 periods. 7 years in Hebron, in which his monarchy was not accepted universally by the people, and then 33 years in Yerushalayim, where his malchus was accepted. You'll recall that he himself wanted to build a Beit HaMikdash. He was told by Natan HaNavi that he is not allowed to do so because he is a man of war, a man of bloodshed, and the Beit HaMikdash must be built through the power of peace, and that is why it was Shlomo who was given that ability. But nevertheless, David HaMelech drew up the plans. David HaMelech created or amassed the gold and the silver and the resources that were needed. He did everything he possibly could, short of actually having the Beit HaMikdash constructed. So far David HaMelech seems to be a person who achieved greatness through struggle and through difficulty. But the end of Shmuel Beis gives us a very sordid and sad left turn in David HaMelech's life, in the wake of which came many, 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 many tragedies. And this starts off with the story of David and Bathsheba, where David is, in fact, according to the Medrash gives us a backstory that David was proud of himself, proud of the righteousness he had made. And David HaMelech said to God, something that is not wise to ever say, God, test me, so you will see that my heart is pure. Now you know, every single day in davening, we ask God not to bring us to a test. If we are given a test, we hope we will pass it. But no person dare be so confident that they could pass the test. But David said to God, test me, God. And immediately, he sees this beautiful woman bathing across the way, and he must have her. He must have her. David's temperament, although he was very, very righteous, but David's temperament was, he had strong passions. He was a person of strong passions. These were his weaknesses. These were his Achilles heel. Again, God forbid, no one is saying that David was generally licentious. He absolutely was not. But this was one of the nisyonos in his life that he had to face. And what happened was, he had relations with Bathsheba, and Bathsheba got pregnant from those relations. And now David has to engage in a cover-up. What's going to be if people discover, because her husband is a soldier in the army, and she gets pregnant, what's going to be? Now in those days you didn't have, reporters that were reporting on all of these things, but still, this could be quite humiliating. So David's act 2 here is, he summons Uriah back from war, and he says, hey Uriah, why don't you take a nice vacation? Why don't you go spend time with your wife and, have a good time? Thinking that he could then deny that this was his child, and, when she ever gives birth, he'll say it's Uriah's child. Uriah, as a loyal soldier, is actually disloyal to the king's order and says, Your Majesty, I really want to get back to the battlefield. They need me there. So David then has a plan 2, a plan B, and he orders Yoav, David's general, to put Uriah on the front lines. Uriah dies in battle. And then David legitimately marries Bathsheba, and then he can cover up the out-of-wedlock pregnancy, or the adulterous pregnancy, by simply saying that it was his child after he married her.
Early.
So far it's working out well. I'll talk about the Gemara's comment in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is, when you have prophets, it's not so easy to get away with things. The Navi Natan HaNavi, Shmuel is no longer alive. Remember, the great Shmuel is dead. He died very young. But the prophet who took Shmuel's role is Natan HaNavi. And Natan HaNavi goes to the king and says, Your Majesty, I want to discuss an issue with you. There was a rich man that had flocks of sheep and cattle. And there was a poor man that had one little sheep. That's all he owned in the world. And the rich man appropriated that sheep for his own banquet, and he slaughtered it. And the poor man was left with nothing at all. What do you think of such a person? And David HaMelech says, that person is wretched, that person is evil. such a person deserves to die. And Natan Hanavi points to David and says, you are that man. That is you. You have the wealth, you have the wives. David had many wives, besides the point. 18 wives. And many children. Shlomo was not his only child. He had many children. And you took the one thing this person had. And if you're going to say, well, he got killed in war, Natan said, you killed him with the sword of the Ammonite. Maybe the Ammonite enemy was the enemy who stuck the sword in him. But you killed him. Don't play technicalities here. Now, what is quite amazing about David is David's response. David responded with only one word. Chatati. I have sinned. In fact, this is actually very, very critical in David's rehabilitation. Because people ask the question, Shaul HaMelech was given a commandment by God to eradicate Amalek. Shaul did fulfill the commandment 99%. He spared some animals, and he spared the king. Shmuel basically conveys the message from God, one strike and you're out. You don't get a second chance. You're out of here. David is with Bathsheba. That's seemingly a more serious affair, although I'll mention what Chazal say. And although David suffered tremendously, as we will see, because the reason I'm going backwards a little bit is because this is the backdrop to Malachim. But David is given a second chance. David is given the ability to go on. And not only that, but his progeny remain king all the way until Mashiach. Why is David given a chance when Shaul is not? So there are two answers that Rav Yosef Albo in the Sefer Ikarim gives, both of which very interesting answers. Answer number one, and this is quite fascinating, is Shaul's sin was in the execution of his duties as monarch. As a monarch, he was obligated to do certain things. He did not do them, therefore he is removed from office. David's sin was a very, very serious personal moral failing, but it was not connected to a political misfeasance in the conduct of his office. Now, those of you that might remember, that's correct, that's exactly right. Some of you might remember, some of you might not. But this was a live debate in the United States regarding Bill Clinton, when Bill Clinton was with Monica Lewinsky or whatever, without getting into the sordid details of that story. The question was, he was committing adultery at a minimum, if not worse. The question was, is adultery grounds for impeachment? So some made the argument it was not, because although adultery was a very serious personal moral sin, it did not pertain to how he executed the responsibilities of the office, as opposed to something like bribery or the like. And there actually is a strong constitutional argument under the U.S. Constitution, probably under Israel as well. It doesn't have a written constitution, but the principle would be that personal moral failures are not connected to political leadership. Now, it is surprising to apply that context in a Torah society, because one would have thought, in a Torah society, what are you talking about? If you're not listening to God's will, then of course you can't be a leader. But Rav Albo suggests this dichotomy even in the case of David HaMelech. But he gives a second answer that I think resonates a bit more. And he says, the difference between Shaul and David was not in the magnitude of their sin. David's sin may have been worse than Shaul's sin. But the difference between Shaul and David is how they respond when they realize that they sinned. If you look in the book of Shmuel, when Shmuel goes over to Shaul and says, why didn't you listen to God? The first thing Shaul does, he denies it. He says, I've listened to Hashem. I've done everything. And then Shmuel says, why do I hear the sheep bleating? So at that point, he can't say he did everything. So instead, he blames others. He equivocates. He says, well, the people made me do it. In other words, denial, equivocation, not taking responsibility. David's greatness was, he acknowledged immediately that he was wrong, that he sinned. And what's interesting is According to Chazal, David actually had a lot of excuses. He had excuses that he could have used and he didn't. You know the famous teaching of Chazal that technically Bathsheba was not a married woman, because when soldiers went to war, they would give their wives a get in order that if they're missing in action, the wives should not be stranded women. By the way, in 1948, the Rabbanut under Rav Herzog was considering whether that should be the policy in the IDF because of missing in action. Even today, women are sometimes agunot for a very long time. They concluded they didn't want to do it as an institutional policy because it would undermine combat morale, because a lot of Chayal always has to have this feeling, if he's married, that his wife is waiting for him. But I understand, someone told me that privately, there are Chayolim, if they're being called to combat duty in high-risk units, and they're religious, that they will give their wife a get every time they're called to active duty. Of course, if you're a Kohen, this doesn't work, unfortunately, because a Kohen divorces his wife, he can't marry her again, but they divorce and they remarry, in order that, if God forbid he's missing in action, she will be able to marry after, well, I guess they have to talk about how much time, a year, whatever it would be.
That would mean that in modern times, if she has relations with a man while her husband is in the battlefield, that she's innocent of any wrongdoing.
That is correct, as a matter of fact, because she was a divorced woman.
Isn't that preposterous?
Well, if she's divorced, she's divorced. What can I tell you? So in truth, the Gemara says Bathsheba was a single woman. And what about David sending him to the front? Isn't he an accessory of murder? So the Talmud says no. Before you had defied a royal order, he could have been executed, which is interesting. You can be executed for not taking a vacation. I mean, David essentially ordered him to take a vacation, says, you're not listening, execute the guy for failure to take a vacation when ordered to take a leave. So the point is, David had excuses. Ad kedei kach that the Gemara's lashon is, anyone that says David sinned is making a mistake. But I think you have to understand, anyone that says David didn't sin is also making a mistake, because it's clear that spiritually, this was adultery and this was murder, even though David had all the technicalities covered. So one of the powerful lessons, see, this is important. A lot of people accuse Chazal of whitewashing the story. I think it's really the opposite. Chazal are telling you something very important, that even when you have the technicalities that defend your action, that does not exonerate you in the eyes of Hashem. I think there's something very powerful. For the Navi to simply tell me adultery and murder are wrong, that's an obvious proposition. But to say, you are an adulterer and you are a murderer, when in fact she had a get, and when in fact he was Chayav Misa, I think that makes a very, very powerful point. You cannot be innocent in the eyes of Hashem when your motives and your reasons are tainted, no matter what technicalities you have that defend your behavior. That is an enormously important lesson. So David, basically, says Rav Yosef Alba, was given a second chance, not because of the nature of his sin, but because of the nature of his response. Leaders can make mistakes. Leaders can do all sorts of things that are wrong. But the key is, as Harry Truman said, the buck stops here. I take responsibility for my actions. I don't blame others. There are leaders in many, many fields who are always willing to take credit for the successes of an organization, and they're always willing to blame others for the things that go wrong. True leadership is almost the opposite. True leadership basically is always willing to share the credit and takes a great, great share of the responsibility for things that do not go right. And that was the greatness of David HaMelech. But one has to understand, there's an expression, sometimes there's a pejorative expression in Christianity called cheap grace, in which you just go to a priest and confess your sins, and you get the grace of God for nothing. Judaism does not believe in cheap grace. There are going to be consequences. God forgives, and God loves you, and God brings you back into his loving embrace. But there are consequences to actions. And the consequences were very, very devastating. David HaMelech did not have an easy life for the rest of his days. First of all, as an initial matter, the baby that he was supposed to have with Bathsheba died shortly after birth. And therefore God said this was a tainted child. This was a child that came from sin and improper motivations. In fact, we don't even know if there was some aspect of rape. It's not described as rape, but how voluntary was it when the king says, and I want to have sexual relations with you. So God says, I'm taking away the kid. That's the first thing. Then we read the horrendous story of Absalom. Absalom was one of David's own children from another wife. And Absalom rises against his father to depose his father and to kill his father if necessary. And David HaMelech is forced, as a relatively old man, already in his 60s, this is within the last decade of his life, to leave Yerushalayim. Not only leave the monarchy, but really running away for his very life. And what happens is, of course, all of the malcontent relatives and friends of Shaul HaMelech, who have been very unhappy for these past few decades, now are jubilant. Shimi ben Gera, a relative of Shaul, is throwing rocks and dirt at David as David is running away and saying, now you're getting what you deserve because you deposed the true anointed one of God, Shaul HaMelech. And then we know, of course, that the story of Absalom has an especially tragic ending because Absalom himself dies. Again, it's such a complicated story. Absalom, on the other hand, wants to kill his father. And what happens is, if you remember the story, Absalom has long, beautiful hair. He's riding a donkey. He gets caught. His hair gets caught in the branch, and he's swinging away. Again, sounds like an unlikely scenario. And Yoav ben Tzruiah, the trigger-happy general of David, who always likes to put David's enemies to death, figures he's doing a great, great favor by killing Absalom. And he kills him. And you might think that perhaps David would be happy that this enemy is gone. But David weeps and sobs and cries. And he says, Absalom, Absalom, why could I not die instead of you? Absalom b'ni, Absalom b'ni. And Chazal say, he said 7 times, Absalom, my son, Absalom, my son. And each time that lifted him up one level. There are 7 levels of Gehenna. Each one lifted him up a little bit. Now we have, of course, in Kidron Valley, Nachal Kidron, we have a certain monument that's historically, traditionally identified as the tomb or the memorial of Absalom. Now, in all probability, I believe that historians and archaeologists basically say it absolutely is not from Absalom. It is from the time of the Crusaders, and it has nothing to do with Absalom. But nevertheless, traditionally, there's a folk tradition that we connect this to Absalom. It's called Yad Absalom. And it is said that when Chaim Shulevitz, whenever he went to the Kotel, he always made a stop at Yad Absalom to pray. He davened at Yad. Now, Yad Absalom is not a big place of prayer. You don't find like minyanim assembled by Yad Absalom to daven there. But he always made a point of davening at Yad Absalom. And it was very emotional. He would sob, he would weep. And somebody said, what are you doing there? Absalom was a Russia, a bad guy. He says, no. He says, from the story of Absalom we see the unconditional love of a father for a son. That even when a son wants to kill his father, the father says, better me than you. I mean, I would rather die than you. So, Reb Chaim Shulevitz says, I go to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and I say, we're your children. We have been unfaithful. We have rebelled. We are undeserving. But even Absalom, look at what his father prayed for. Can you not, God, be the same as David HaMelech in his care for the unworthy Absalom? Right? So he felt it was a very moving place for him to go to. So David lost this baby, David lost his son Absalom. David suffered the humiliation of being deposed. And then there's another story there as well in the aftermath of David and Bathsheba. David's oldest son was Amnon, and there's a whole sordid story of Amnon raping Taka, his half-sister Tamar, the half-sister meaning from another mother. And David is facing all of this, and all of the Meforshim understand that this was somehow the aftermath of David and Bathsheba, in which all of these sufferings had to be played out. So this brings us to the beginning of the book of Malachim, which in fact is the Haftorah for Chayai. I didn't even begin the actual Haftorah yet. I was giving you the necessary background. And we describe a king who's only 70 years old. Now 70 is not young, but you know what they say? 70 is the new 50, what do they say? You know, people are, and the like, and especially as I get a little closer, I'm not quite there yet. 70 is much younger than I used to think it was. You know, people used to say, don't trust anyone above 30. That was the motto of the hippies in the 60s until Abby Hoffman became 30. Then he had to change the motto a little bit. But David is worn out. David is spent. You could imagine that, you know, perhaps this actually happened just the last 10 years. You know, this last 10 years took everything out of him. Lost his children. Lost many, many things. And it says he is shivering with cold. And even though he's covered with garments, the garments give him no warmth. So here Chazal have a very interesting observation. Like, why does he make a point he's covered with blankets, with garments? So Chazal say, we see from here an important lesson, that if you treat garments with disrespect, the garments will not help you at the end. And it goes back to the story that when David was a young man, and Saul was pursuing David to kill David, at one point, when Saul was relieving himself in a cave, in a ma'ara, he left his cloak outside, and David cut off a little piece of the cloak, and then he's standing on a mountaintop or a hilltop, and he's showing Saul, you see how close I was to you? I cut off a piece of your cloak. I could have killed you very easily. You were very vulnerable in there. So why do you look at me as your enemy? And if you remember, Shaul momentarily was appeased, and they said, my beloved David, etc. Then eventually he turned against him again. Now it's interesting. Chazal don't accuse David of being disrespectful to the king, because David actually was the king. But he was disrespectful to a piece of clothing. So wives should be sure to tell their husbands that don't throw your clothing around, etc. Because you treat clothing with disrespect, the clothing eventually doesn't get you warm. Now, so they come up with something which to the modern reader seems very, very bizarre, but you actually added a perspective here, and they said, well, clothing isn't working, but maybe a human body will somehow stimulate the warmth within him. And they look for a beautiful virgin woman, and she's found Avisha Kashunamit from the city of Shunam, and the pasuk makes the point, and David did not know her, which is another way of saying they did not have sexual relations. Now here I want to point out something very interesting. All the years that I've learned this, and I think the vast majority of at least the religious people who learn this understand that this is essentially making a righteous statement about David, that don't think this was a matter of sexual passion and gratification. This was simply a matter of warmth. He needed warmth, the garments weren't working, maybe a human being would work. In other words, the ish hu lo yada'a is kind of describing David's spiritual state, that he did not use her in a sexual way. But for the first time I recently saw an alternative explanation that to me fits a lot of the narrative here. And that is, it is not making the point he didn't want to have sexual relations with her. The intention actually was she would be a mistress that would a pelegesh, that would somehow stimulate him. And when it says he did not know her, it is referring to he lost his ability. He was impotent. Meaning, not that he didn't want. Now, again, overall, let me explain what's going on here. One of the ways this whole parak is understood, we're going to see that while David is still alive, there is a major battle between the sons. Who will take over? It is known that David HaMelech favors the second son. The first son he had from Bathsheba died. The second son he had from Bathsheba is none other than Shlomo HaMelech, who at this time is not an old man. Shlomo HaMelech is only 12 years old. But he has an older brother, Adoniyahu ben Chagit. Adoniyahu ben Chagit figures the following. Shlomo is a kid. I could push him around very easily. My father is an impotent, sick, old man who really doesn't know what's going on. This is an ideal time for a power grab. So Adoniyahu is not quite as bad as Avshalom. Avshalom wanted to depose and kill his father at a time when David was still vigorous and in control. Yiboneh, as far as we know, is not attempting to harm David in any way, but he's basically trying to create the scenario to emphasize there is a leadership vacuum in Am Yisrael. We have to fill it. So according to this, some have suggested, this is a daring suggestion, which is not said in classical commentators, that the whole idea of getting the virgin was part of Adoniyahu's own manipulation to highlight the weakness, the impotence, and the incapacity of David HaMelech. In other words, he was the leaker, right? You know, Donald Trump is always talking about the people that are leaking. In other words, this idea, hey, we got him a beautiful woman. Again, forgive me for the indelicacy. And he couldn't even be with her. Meaning this is part of the strategy to discredit and demean David. And then the argument is, and Shlomo's a kid. That's the implicit second part of the argument. Therefore, we need a man of action, a man of power, a man of determination. And in fact, if you look at what Adoniyahu did not proclaim himself as king. Because if he would have done that, that would have been too blatant. Rather, what he does is, he makes a party, he invites influential people. Meaning, he's positioning himself to eventually make the statement, hey, I'm the guy that's well connected. I'm the guy that knows how to organize people. You'll see, if you read the Pasuk, you will actually see he does not directly say, I am the king. But he's trying to create the environment where that choice is going to be seen as inevitable and the like. And he gets a number of people who are politically very well connected. Yoav ben Tzeruiah, David's overzealous general, because Yoav, after all, what does Yoav look for in a leader? Decisiveness, strength, determination. Yoav sees this much more in Adoniyahu. Evyasar HaKohen, we don't know exactly why, but Evyasar was the Kohen Gadol, and he gravitated to Adoniyahu. A second Kohen who became Kohen Gadol as a result of this, but he was not Kohen Gadol at the time, was Sadok. And Nasan HaNavi, most importantly, Nasan the prophet, stayed with Shlomo and the like. Now, Shlomo himself is initially not involved in this at all, meaning to say, Shlomo doesn't even know what his brother is doing. But Nasan HaNavi knows, either through prophecy or he just knows. And the fact that he wasn't invited, he actually sees that as a sign that Adoniyahu's leadership is not going to be based on spiritual truth. So he goes to Bathsheba and he says, you know that this Adoniyahu is trying to usurp the Malchut from your son. And they concoct a plan where each of them separately will go to David. First, the order here Yeah, first the mother, right? Go to your husband David and talk to him about it, and then I will come in and give the prophetic imprimatur that there is a plot that is going on. And there's a description here. Bathsheba goes to the inner chamber of the king, the bedroom of the king, that very few people go into. And the king is very old, and it says Avishag Hashunamit is servicing the king. That's the actual word, Misharet et HaMelech. This is a bit of an odd scene for a wife, although maybe when there are many wives, maybe it's not quite as bad as you might imagine it. That Bathsheba comes to the inner chamber of the king while he is being warmed by Abishag Hashunamit. But she doesn't lose her composure, although one could imagine that this might be a bit emotionally distressing. And she bows down to the king, and the king says, "What can I do for you?" And he says, she says, "You swore that Shlomo will become the king, and behold, Adoniyahu is trying to become king, etc. He is bringing offerings, he is inviting many politically well-connected people, etc. And then Natsan HaNavi comes, because after all, you see, you're building up credibility here, because if she simply says Adoniyahu is a rival, that doesn't mean anything, because Adoniyahu really just made a party. He didn't really proclaim himself. But Natan HaNavi puts the prophetic imprimatur, and then what happens is that David HaMelech finally gets his energy back, so to speak. And he's very decisive, and he orders that Shlomo be anointed king at Gichon. Gichon is the Shiluach, right? Siluah. That was the main water supply for Yerushalayim, the Gichon, and that is where kings are anointed, because just as a river is a gushing, renewing current, so too we ask Hashem's blessing. May the king's malchut be nimshach, may it continue to gush and flourish. And it ends with the proclamation of everyone, Yechi HaMelech, may Shlomo HaMelech live, may he prosper. David, of course, was not able to attend the coronation because he was sick, but nevertheless, this is how the issue of succession was resolved. Now, again, if you look at it from a political perspective, if you look at it from a political perspective, you see that here's the issue in a political analysis. David HaMelech had two different personalities, two different faces. David HaMelech was active. David HaMelech was passionate. He was a warrior. He was strong. He was sensual. And yet that same David HaMelech that was the great warrior and the decisive leader was a deeply righteous and spiritual person at the same time. He is the author of most of the Tehillim, in which he explores his relationship to God in many, many ways. He is called, in the book of Shmuel, Ne'im Semichot Yisrael, the sweet singer of beautiful songs of praise to God. So David is a relatively rare combination, because normally we perceive of the tzaddik as kind of a withdrawn person, a person who's not involved in the rough and tumble of society. And yet David had these two attributes. David was the aggressive warrior and the passionate, sensual person and the man of action. In fact, if you remember at the end of Shmuel, David HaMelech had a practice that when his army went to war, he would position himself in the front of the troops, which is something a general normally does not do, even for good reasons. And finally, his men forced him to not be in the head of the battle. But his nature was, if I'm sending you out to battle, I'm going to fight with you. And yet, that same person was the righteous meditator on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, David, as a multifaceted person, had these different aspects to himself. And some sons had one aspect, and some sons had other aspects. The Avshaloms and Adoniyos of the world had the sensuality, had the passion, had the determination, had the military prowess. Shlomo, number one, was young. Number two, Shlomo was scholarly. Shlomo was introspective. Shlomo was spiritual, although later he had certain problems. The power may have gone to his head, but at least initially, remember, he's the one that asks God for wisdom. God offers him wealth and power. He says he just wants wisdom. So you can understand, which David do we want to take over? Remember the story of the 7 men and the elephants. 7 blind men. 7 blind men feel an elephant. And they're asked to describe, what does an elephant feel like? What do you think it looks like? So one person who felt the trunk said, oh, an elephant is a long eel, a long snake. Another person who felt the ears of the elephant says, oh, an elephant is a gigantic butterfly. Someone who felt the stomach said, an elephant is like a hippopotamus, whatever it would be. All of them are wrong, because the elephant has all of these characteristics. But each one only sees part of the, not sees, in the case of flying, but each one understands only part of the legacy. David is multifaceted. Yoav sees the general, the heroic general in war, and says, I want an Adoniyo type of guy to be the leader. But Natan HaNavi, the Shaliach of God, understands that, yeah, military prowess is important, political skills are important, passion is important, but ultimately it is the connection with Hashem that is the true foundation of leadership. And therefore it is Shlomo that, at least at this point in his life, has that quality in spite of his youth, in spite of his inexperience, in spite of his passivity. So it is helpful to kind of view this in the sense of a political struggle about the contested legacy, the contested and mixed legacy of David HaMelech, and the fact that succession for Jewish leadership must ultimately be based on spiritual qualities, even if there might be better people in some of the other qualities that were there. In any event, as we know, the Jewish empire reached its maximum size during the reign of Shlomo HaMelech anyway, and he was blessed with not having to confront military struggles and war. So that's kind of the perspective. So once again, the common denominator between the Haftorah and the Parsha is succession passing on the basis of spiritual considerations. But as I say, in the Parsha, the transition is very, very smooth. In the Haftorah, it's very, very turbulent. And I should go on that although the Haftorah only has the first parak of Malachim, in the second parak of Malachim, the struggle continues. Because even after Adoniyo sees that Shlomo is king, and what's interesting is, unlike Avshalom, Adoniyo does not contest his father's decision. That's actually very interesting. Once David has proclaimed Shlomo is king, Adoniyo apparently makes peace with them. He's not working in the way Avshalom worked. Maybe he's a smarter operator. He saw where that got Avshalom. And of course, remember, Adoniyo's key ally is Yoav. And Yoav is ultimately very loyal to David. You understand? I mean, Yoav was the one who killed Avshalom. If Adoniyo turns against David, even in David's weakness, Yoav may kill Adoniyo. So Adoniyo seemingly concedes to the coronation of Shlomo. David then dies. In Perek Beis, Adoniyo makes a very bizarre request. And it's fascinating. He doesn't make the request directly. He goes to Bathsheba. Now, Bathsheba, you would figure, would not be so friendly and predisposed towards Adoniyo, because Adoniyo was the one who was trying to take the Malchus away from Bathsheba's son. But he goes to Bathsheba and says, no hard feelings. Shlomo was coronated. Great. Could you go to the king, though, the king, Shlomo, the king, and ask for a favor on my behalf? So Bathsheba considers that a little odd. Like, why am I asking for favors on your behalf? I mean, go to your father. You want a favor? Not your father. Go to your brother. And the favor, remember, David died, but the favor that Adoniah wants is he would like to marry Avishag Hashunamit, this beautiful woman that was Misharet David in the last months of David's life. And David did not have sexual intercourse with her. And David did not marry her, so it's not his father's widow. It says, beautiful woman. She's now part of the royal court. I'd like to take her for a wife. Ask the king, if I can do it. So Bathsheba, all she does is she conveys the request as is. No commentary, no pshat. Shlomo gets absolutely infuriated. And he takes a step that one might think is a bit of an overreaction. Essentially, he orders Adoniah to be killed. Adoniah is killed for making that request. Now you wonder, like, what is going on? Couldn't you just say no? And apparently, this is a much deeper issue. And the issue here is that Shlomo perceives that Adoniah is trying to establish his entitlement to the monarchy in a very indirect way, because there is a general concept that anything that belonged to the king, let's say possessions, scepters, chairs, can only be used by the king. Meaning there's kind of a royal entitlement that no one else can use the intimate possessions of a melech. Now, it's true, I know it's a little demeaning to talk about a human being as a possession. It's hard to know how to characterize Abishag. She was not a wife. She was not a concubine. The assigned function that she has is a human blanket.
A quilt, yeah.
A quilt, right. Now, the truth of the matter is, if you're not a king, you don't get the king's quilt. You don't get Abishag. Now, if you're trying to get Abishag, then in the eyes of the public, that may indicate, why did Shlomo let Adoniah get the king's intimate possession? Maybe Shlomo is a little insecure. He feels he's not really ready to be king. Maybe he's actually conceding it. So Adoniah this is a very devious kind of argument in which Adoniah is trying to establish indirectly a claim and an entitlement to the monarchy through Shlomo's own consent. So Shlomo sees that Adoniah's apparent acceptance of the coronation in the lifetime of David was really only a ruse for a further attempt to undermine, and therefore as an enemy to the king. The halacha is, this is called Mored b'malchut, he is actually chayav misa. Now, once Shlomo opens this up, though, what do they say? The first murder is the hardest. Meaning, a person has to get over a lot of natural inhibitions to kill another human being, even if they deserve it.
Especially his brother.
Yeah, especially his brother. But once you do it, the other ones get a little easier. And then he turns to another fellow who is not related to the family, Shimi ben Gera. Now, Shimi ben Gera, this is a very, very strange story, just to remind you again. Shimi ben Gera was a man from the tribe of Binyamin. In fact, he's an ancestor of Mordechai. His descendant was the Mordechai of the Purim story. Shimi ben Gera threw rocks and dirt, clods of mud, at David and mocked him as he's fleeing Yerushalayim to get away from Absalom, the other son, Absalom. Yoav wanted to kill Shimi ben Gera at the time. David uttered a very immortal, spiritual, saintly sentiment that basically said, everything that happens to a human being is decreed by the Almighty. If God did not want me to be shamed or humiliated, this wouldn't have happened. Now, Philosophically, this raises an enormous issue of the intersection of free will and human suffering. I'm not going to address that right now. But the one thing we can say for sure is that David's attitude was forgiving, David's attitude was accepting, David's attitude is don't attack. Turn the other cheek, essentially. Okay, well that's fine. But on David's deathbed, he gives Shlomo an instruction. David gave the instruction, and he said, be sure you take care of this Shimi ben Gera and give him what he deserves. So right off the bat, you got a real problem. Because on one hand, and it's not so much a problem with Shlomo, it's a problem with David, or at least a kasha with David. Because David exemplifies forgiveness, forbearance, willingness to accept humiliation and pain, because it all comes from God, so I must accept it with love. And then he tells Shlomo, after I'm gone, take care of it. And indeed, in Malachim, just to finish the story, it talks about what Shlomo did. Shlomo set up a kind of a trap. He told Shimei, listen, I'm not going to kill you. Now, why did he say that? It's not clear. Why didn't he just do it? But he said, I'm not going to kill you, but I'm putting you under city arrest. You stay in Jerusalem. Don't leave the city. And the day that you leave the city, you're a goner. It's like an air miklat. Don't leave. And the story goes, he had some slaves that escaped, and he went looking for the slaves. And of course, Shlomo had people watching his movements, and at that point, that gave Shlomo the excuse to kill him. Rav Chaim Shmulevitz used to say a very interesting verse. He says, what type of idiot is Shimei? I mean, he knows if he leaves Jerusalem, he's going to get killed, or he might get killed. He could have sent other people to look for his slaves. Why is he putting his life in danger over this? So Chaim Shmulevitz said, psychologically, a very interesting idea. If he wouldn't have been told that he couldn't leave, he wouldn't have left. As soon as you're told you can't do something, there's an unbearable urge. I gotta do it. Even if he wasn't confined to a house, he was confined to a city. So a person can live in Yerushalayim and never leave. But as soon as you're told you can never leave the city again, you have to get out. You have to get out. And that's what Shlomo was playing on. That's the idea that a person just can't stand to be confined. And they'll even take risks to their life. But be it as it may, the question still is, and I'll just end with this question, is how do we understand David? Is David the forgiving, accepting, humble person? Or is David out to settle scores after he dies? Like, what's going on here? Did he just change his mind? It's tricky. I don't have a 100% answer, but I would suggest maybe the following idea. And that is, David HaMelech did not want to act out of vengeance and anger. David HaMelech wanted to act out of a judgment of what would be best for the Jewish people. Now, halachically, Shimi ben Gera was Chayav Misa. He publicly assaulted the monarch, and that's a Chayav Misa. But David didn't want to act in the heat of the moment. Because had he acted in the heat of the moment, part of his action would have been not the abstract halachic principle. It would have been his own anger and his own humiliation. So he waited until he no longer had those feelings of rage, and then made a disinterested judgment as to what is best for Klal Yisrael. I remember hearing from the Boston Rebbe, Zichrono Livracha, that his father, who was the first Boston Rebbe in Boston, used to hit him. If he misbehaved, he would hit him. But his father always waited 24 hours. In other words, if the boy did something wrong, the father would not hit him right away. The father would hit him 24 hours later, because he wanted to discipline him based on an objective judgment that this is what is best for the child. Because if I hit because I'm angry, I'm upset, then I'm not always thinking about what is best for the child. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I once mentioned this story to a child psychologist, and she had a problem. She said that little kids don't have a very good sense of time and memory. So you hit a kid 24 hours after something was done. The kid doesn't even remember what it's connected to in any way. So she felt there was a bit of a problem. Okay, I understand. But the point that one does not discipline a child because they're in a bad mood, in other words, is a very valid point. Parents have a mitzvah to properly discipline children. That's 100% true. Disciplining a child, again, I'm not endorsing hitting, but whatever it would be, setting limits is a very important part of chinuch. But it always has to be because it is the best interest of the child, not because I had a bad day at work and I'm upset over things that happened elsewhere. Again, I'm not putting myself up as a tzaddik. I mean, I fail at this as much as anyone else fails at it. That's something we work on. But in theory, any discipline directed to a child has to be only because it is the best thing for the child, and not because I'm angry, I'm upset. So if you have to wait until you discipline, there would be a point. There would be a point and a justification for that. Okay, so you all have a good week and a good Shabbos. See you next week.